From the very beginning of my establishment of this podcast, I have wanted my listeners to feel the joy and the excitement and the astonishment and the miracle of language and language learning on all humans and how we connect with ourselves and with others. And that's certainly true for this podcast today with my guest, Charlie Hanchett. Charlie also has a philosophy that helps us to connect the language learning and language use to a bigger picture of how we relate to the world in general, the way we listen, the way we respond, the way we relate to others, how our own motivation comes to play in the miracle of language, and how we bring those parts of language that are not always expressed in words into the midst of our communication and connection with others. It was my pleasure to meet and work with Charlie Hanchett early on in my career with a publishing company, and I was struck by Charlie's insights and philosophy even during the interview. And you'll be able to tell during this conversation that we have a long history of sharing the way that language and language learning has an impact on the way we see the world. I know you'll enjoy this conversation with Charlie Hanchett, but I want you to take also time to reflect on how you have learned, used, and reacted to language in your life and the lives of others. Enjoy this podcast with my guest, Charlie Hanchett. How are you doing?
We're all kind of like cooped up right now in our little house by the sea in Massachusetts and covered in snow. So there's small square footage and no one going outside. So we're trying to just be like super patient with each other. And when it comes to language, watching our tone as we communicate, the morning routine and all that stuff. And so it's good. I'm looking forward to the winter break and getting into a warmer space. We haven't been away for quite some time, and we're going to get to go down to Puerto Rico to visit some of the old haunts. I used to live there and taught ESL there. And so that'll be fun to stroll down memory lane and then also get out west and do some paddleboarding and maybe even some surfing.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, as a matter of fact, it's interesting that you brought up Puerto Rico so early on in our conversation, because I was looking at, the background that you had and the fact that you had taught there. Tell me a little bit more about what is it that brought you to Puerto Rico? What were you doing there? How long were you there? And what did you gain from that? The old haunts tells me it must have been a good experience.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. So yeah, so backing up right before I went to Puerto Rico, I was in my mid-20s. And what's funny is I'm finding this is the career arc for a lot of people. And I thought I was, somehow like sui generis and I'm the only one who did this. Started out teaching right after college and then realized like I wanted to travel, but I also like wasn't sure if that just was going to be like my career in the classroom. And so I ended up leaving a position in a classroom in Maryland for another job that didn't really pan out. And it was in like the business world in New York City. And like I thought I thought I could do it. And it just the more it sat with me, it just didn't feel right. So as luck would have it, a friend of mine was like talking to me about his career in he was like a paralegal. And he's like, this is not for me. I want to go get certified to teach ESL and go abroad. So we got our certification in Prague, in Czech Republic, in like 2005. So we went there, took a month-long course, got ESL certified. I taught in a Prague high school. I taught at like a business in the city. It's really neat experience, incredible. But as far as so we'd all go branch out and find out where we want to go afterwards. A lot of people stayed in the city. I tried Barcelona for a bit, didn't work. I realized, oh my gosh, I don't have I'm not a European citizen, so I can't be here forever. So I ended up doing going back to the States after the certification. And I was talking to a friend of mine. We were waiting tables, which is like, if you're teaching at a private school and in the summertime, waiting tables was a great way to earn extra money. And he's like, "I'm thinking about going down to Puerto Rico." I'm like, "What for?" He's like, "Just because." And I was
Just
thinking, well, I could probably find an ESL job there. And that's exactly what happened. So we went down there in January of 2006 and, got a job at Pali Language Institute in Guaynabo, like in the suburbs and south of Old San Juan, and, taught classes there, one-on-ones, group classes, night classes, all that kind of stuff.
all right. What were some of the experiences you had there? What were some of the stories that came out of it? People were taking English for various reasons.
Right.
What did you learn as well as what did you find that you were teaching them?
Well, I'll I'll answer with a quote that very familiar, know very well is that language was, not a luxury, a necessity. And for a lot of those folks, they, so locals to the island, Puerto Ricans, they had English in school, but they found that, they either didn't like pay attention enough. I mean, this is one story that one of my students told me. He's like, I didn't, it wasn't important to me at the time. So
Mm,
what happens? He meets someone, his wife, and he gets a job and he moves up in his career. And eventually there are stateside options for him. But his English proficiency was at a level that really they couldn't make that move until he was at a higher level. So he had this real life necessity to be like, okay, I want to do everything I can to improve my English. And it was
yeah.
only in his adulthood that actually it came alive for him, and the will to learn and the determination was there. And when you have that with adult learners, I mean, it's so cool. They're asking all these follow up questions. There's no motivation really involved because it's all self motivated. So that was a really neat experience to see folks that were like they had the English in school and they if you live in tourist areas, there's English spoken a lot, and so if you have folks who
Mm,
grew up in Old San Juan, like they grew up speaking English, but for a lot of them, it wasn't an everyday thing, and so until
mhm.
I think those career paths started to lay out before them, they realized, all right, how am I going to have to level up certain skills, and one of them was English.
That's very cool. And, it's interesting because I know that there are folks that are listening that tend to potentially think that because language learning happens so easily, organically for young people, that it's hard to learn language as an adult. Would you say that the motivation, that idea that indeed language is, as you quoted back there, the necessity, not a luxury, that kind of opens up options in the mind and the spirit so that adults do learn effectively?
Yeah, I mean the idea of I mean, there are certain stories we tell ourselves the older we get. I'm 46 now at this time, and in 2026, and uh, I, I I have some language learning goals that I've had that have fallen by the wayside. I'm going to learn Portuguese, and you get into it, and there's discipline involved, but it really wasn't. It wasn't a necessity for me to learn it. So that I didn't develop that discipline because I wasn't highly motivated. I think yeah, I mean everybody, Tolstoy learned to ride a bike when he was 70. We can all learn. We should all be lifelong learners. This is one of the big trends it's a trend, but it's true to life, is that we all ought to be learning. I think it can be more challenging if you're not only doing school. I tell my
Mm.
girls, I'm like, hey, your job right now is to be doing school, and I'll go to work, and and that so that they understand that there are certain points of focus for them. And so when it's all academic, you can really build in y- you can excel better at language acquisition when you're in school, and you don't have as many and you can like make connections to the language, your own language, and all the other disciplines. And that's what's the neat thing about the world language classroom, which is something I've always loved. It's like if you are thoughtful in your planning, especially as a faculty or group of teachers, you can really make kids have lots more connections in their other courses from the language classrooms. I think as an adult, I'm still I keep up my Spanish. I'm practicing more passively some other languages, but it's like anything. It's a challenge if you're not able to keep doing it on a daily basis
Daily basis. Yeah, yeah. Well, and
every day.
yeah, it's true, interesting, isn't it? It's like people that say, "I took 2 years of X and I can't say a thing," and I'm like, "Well, I took 2 years of phys ed and I still haven't made it into the Olympics." It's like, seriously,
That's it.
we have to be able to do something daily to keep it up.
Absolutely. I love that you brought that up because I've been thinking so much about that, and from a I work in sales and sales operations, but I'm also, a parent, and I look at the school systems and principals, and those experiences where when we talk about the value of the language classroom, they only think of it in terms of, are we producing proficient to fluent speakers? And that's absolutely not the way to think about it. First of all, because absent immersion, it is really challenging to take 50 minutes a day, 3 days a week during your school year over the course of 3 to 4 years and have a advanced low or even like intermediate high speaker. Outside immersion, that doesn't really happen, but it's all the other soft skills that you're learning in the language classroom that is going to determine your relationships, your career path, all sorts of different opportunities for you as you move on to college or work, whatever it may be. And that short sightedness of, well, all I learned was Puerto Rico and uh, so therefore it has no value. They're hearkening back to their own experience is so short-sighted, and I would encourage everyone to understand, like, how learning a language and look up the research, and I would love to ask you some questions about it when you think about it, how it informs L1, our first language, and what are those soft skills that companies desperately need and that, our relationships need in terms of communication and listening and problem solving that we can do in our L1, in our first language, because we had all those opportunities to play and practice with a second language.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, Charlie. And I think it's interesting because as you were talking about soft skills in that global way, you then brought in a couple, and one of them that I think is key that people don't necessarily think of as part of the language classroom because they're thinking about talking
Mhm.
and talking fluently is that listening, the listening skill and to be able to be aware and how it does play into then the first language that any other language that because it's about the human connection going on. As a matter of fact, the question I have is, in your educational background, you
Mhm.
clearly were on fire in some way because of the language, and did you feel personally like the language experience when you were coming up through the school systems were helping you to connect with other disciplinary areas
Other
and with the world in a way that made you who you are potentially?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the questions going back there and saying, did those things actually take effect? My first Spanish course was in California. When you're in Southern California, a different, there's a different vibe around your Spanish class, because it's so prevalent in that part of the country. So my, my experience there kinda led me to think about well, first of all, I felt like I was really good at it. I had this sort of mathematical mind and the sequencing of the, noun, verb, all that stuff and the conjugations, like those charts. I wasn't afraid of those. I looked at those. Those are intriguing to me. And look at that. What is this Vosotra? Oh, wait, we don't have to learn that yet? Okay. But I'm gonna put that in the back of my mind. That was all interesting to me. And I was speaking Spanish with a mathematical mind, just very quickly putting these words together without real like fluency, so to speak, and I'm in
Mhm.
quotations. Um, so I just felt like I was really good at it, and in contrast to your question, I kind of felt like this was an oasis from some of my other courses that were,
Oh.
either less interesting or didn't have, like, immediate applicability to in the sense that I could go outside and hear Spanish at the grocery store and, or in my high school job, and I could immediately apply it. That was incredibly neat to be able to have a classroom experience, walk outside and apply it at 15, 16, 17. No other disciplines. I mean, outside of maybe even English grammar, but I mean, that was the one other discipline. Both my parents are English teachers. So you can imagine what the dinner table was like and the edification going on. Very sweet. Like in retrospect, like so many things our parents tell us when we're kids, we think we know better, but then we become adults or we become parents and we're like, oh yeah, okay, that all makes sense. What you were trying to get me to do or coaxing me to consider. So with my L1, with English, that was to me it was fascinating when I learned that in Spanish you don't end your sentence in a preposition. I'm like, hey, wait, I think we used to not end our sentences in prepositions in English as well. Or was it the ellipsis? Like he is older than I, and you would never say he is older than me in Spanish. So there was all these neat connections I was making, linguistic comparisons with L1, and it really informed my English. And I even started like using certain phrases in English because I love the word in Spanish, like
Okay.
convivir, conviviality, and
Oh,
like increasing my vocab power because of all these like neat cognates I was learning in the Spanish classroom. So that was really neat. Otherwise, like I didn't really get into the cultural aspect
mm,
until later in life. Like really like until I went abroad in college, and that was when the linguistic stuff sort of took a backseat. And that interesting mathematical approach I had to it, that curiosity. Now it was whoa, well, like, why are they, what the body language, all those other ways in which we express our language non-verbally that you learn in a culture. That's when it really like took flight for me and took on a different form.
What that it's an interesting two-step, and both of them having to do with that interest. I was thinking the other day, and it just strikes me that I know I'm in the area of language, but
Hmm.
I also feel like, honestly, Charlie, that people that are in the language space have a lot of energy,
Hmm.
seem to have a lot of excitement about life, and sometimes I'm wondering, is it chicken or egg? Are people that are naturally curious and excited about life tending to go in the direction of this very humane thing called language? Or does language help to spark people feeling more engaged with the world, more alive with the world? Or kind of, I guess it can depend on the person, but what do
Right.
you think about the idea that language sparks something in people?
Yeah, or is it, going back to the chicken or the egg, I was watching a video the other night, it was like, you don't feel better to go outside, you go outside to feel better. And I think there
mm,
are certain times in your life where the feeling will determine the action, but I'm finding more and more as I get older that the action determines the feeling. So do
interesting.
then feel kind of, and when it comes to I think expanding your global experience, uh, I I go back and forth on that because I think everyone should travel as much as they can, but I don't think that if you don't, you have somehow, not experienced the full human condition. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
for a lot of times when Americans travel abroad, they are speaking to and learning from people who have not traveled abroad, who know their local culture better than anyone could because they are in tune with that culture. And there was a line from preacher Tim Keller in Manhattan. He references Miss Marple, who's the Agatha Christie character, I think, And she's
Uh-huh.
somebody who was just so in tune with humans and how they behave and how they interact. She had never left her small English town, but was able to, intuit so much about human behavior and experience just because she was just so observant and she noticed everything in patterns and all that stuff. And she was curious. So, she didn't jet set around the world, but still had a full, I think, human experience as a result.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think about in my own background, I thought for sure that I was going to be living and working in Europe, the UN. Of course, most people
Yeah.
that like languages are gonna work for the UN, from what I understand, and just that was my trajectory. I was very confident in it. The man
Mhm.
that I met and married that lived on a farm in Virginia was not a person that had gone all sorts of places around the world, had successfully studied a whole bunch of languages or anything like it. But his dad reminds me of the story that you just told, Charlie. His dad was a dairy farmer, an orchardist first, a dairy farmer who read incessantly. And among the things that he read, along with Westerns, was the National Geographic. He read and read and read and was knowledgeable in a very humane way about how humans work and how the world works. And it brought it to his 3 sons, including the one that I ended up hitching up with. And that sense of enjoying humanity, understanding the cultural aspects, understanding diversity, uh, definitely was part of what his father's legacy was, just sitting in his farmhouse by the fire, reading National Geographics.
Mhm.
So
No, it's
and
it
I
the
think that your
no, it's I
reflection is
was
very helpful.
yeah, absolutely, and I think those we especially Gen X and we have lots of things we think about when it comes to this world, and we historically have had this sort of whatever, approach to, institutions or trying and I don't know, I'm making generalizations, but they're general because there are certain patterns you see with,
Mhm.
certain generations, and I think that what I love about that approach is that, it doesn't mean that you have to have, certain ducks in a row or certain, you know, baseline levels of travel or exposure or experience to live a full life, to live, to have had meaningful relationships that are not just, topical or, around, when you think about the cultural iceberg, that's just food and dance and music. It's actual,
Yeah,
digging into beliefs and values and why we are the way that we are and how we treat each other. So it's a good reminder for folks who are either reticent about traveling or don't think that or in if you're young and you're in a classroom and you think you have to be fluent or that you don't and that life is going to take a lot of twists and turns and whatever you learned in that classroom is going to inform you whether you're speaking that target language or not just from a human relationship standpoint.
that's really neat, Charlie. Thank you for saying that. You know, we one of the things that happened is you turned your attention to a job opportunity
Mm.
back in the early 2000s in the, language education publishing field, and I remember a conversation of asking you, what is it that you really, really are interested in when you take a look at materials from the point of view of what it is that you would find joy in speaking about. You
Do you
wanna
remember what I said?
remind
Or are you
I do
asking me to
actually,
remember?
I do remember, and the thing is I would love for you to say what it was that you were thinking, what you
Oh
said,
boy.
and the kind of impact that it can make.
Oh boy. Well, I don't know if you'll have to tell me if I'm right or not, but if I have a chance to reconsider it or rethink about it, just for your audience, you were my manager for a certain standpoint, but more so my mentor for a solid 10 years that we spent together with Vista. And I think about when you opened up that book in that office during my interview and say, kind of what do you see? If I hadn't if I hadn't had my ESL training, the way that I did, I I probably would have given you a less interesting answer. I see verbs and I see exercise and there's a listening exercise, but I imagine that there was something about, a progression or, learning in context. There was a lot of really neat, like, CI strategies I applied when I was teaching in Czech Republic, and ways that I thought, oh, that's a really neat way to approach. If you have a curriculum or don't, like bringing it to life. Instead of just introducing it, why don't you activate prior knowledge, or why don't you get folks to think about their own experiences and what tools they already bring to the classroom, verbal, nonverbal, personality wise, like all those great experiences that they're bringing in, that whole universe of themselves that they're bringing into the classroom. And you really brought that out from me, and got me to think about those students not as that sort of this audience that I've got to perform for, but these real individuals who can actually contribute to the outcome of a really successful class, with the
Yeah.
tools they already have in place, which is so cool.
Isn't
I
it
don't know if
cool?
that
What have you
I got a rift on
Yeah.
that off of.
Mm, that's and the thing is that riffing can continue. What have you seen?
Mm.
What have you experienced over these years? What has been reaffirmed for you or strengthened, and where have you potentially seen other pathways from the way that folks approach language?
Yeah, I was thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about lately. I don't know, for some reason. Maybe it's like a show I found on. It was on like Fox in like the aughts, called Lie to Me. And it was about a guy who picked up on body language and could tell anytime someone was lying. And the whole point of it was, we're speaking even when we're not. We're communicating even when we're not. And I know there's that stat. It's like 73855 goes. It's really around like how meaning is communicated. They say 55% of your meaning is communicated through body language.
Mm,
38% is through your tone of voice, and only 7 is through your spoken word.
yeah.
And we are hyper articulate, I find, in our society these days. We're doing podcasts, we're communicating in all these different ways, and we find it to be very important, which it is. But when we actually are conveying meaning, so much of it can get caught up in our tone and our body language. So, what was encouraging to me about that was that, if someone wasn't, I've sometimes been reticent, as I'm the fourth of 5, and so I didn't exactly have a voice, growing up. I was
Mm,
sort of just carted along and all that, and so it's always been a challenge for me, is when do I speak up?
yeah.
And I think that goes hand in hand with my own generation of Gen X. We're kind of caught in between the boomers and the millennials, the two biggest generations that have ever existed. And the
Ah,
boomers and their institutions, and millennials and their activism, and where is our role as Gen Xers, and where is our voice? And often it can be communicated through unspoken things. So as I've gotten older, I've learned, especially with my daughters, my wife, and is how important tone is in communicating. I'm from the Northeast. I'm from Long Island, and I mean, I don't have an accent, but it's not just the accent, it's the attitude in how people communicate. They're direct. I mean, just like anybody in the Northeast, you crack that outer shell and they are warm and loyal and just as friendly as anybody can be. But they want to see a little bit from you before they
mm,
open up, and that's fair enough. A lot of that comes from nature and nurture, that, growing up, and a lot of recent immigrants, Long Island, and Greeks, Italians, and just big communicators in all
mhm.
sorts of ways, gestures and body language and stuff like that. So that's been a part to me, that's been really important, is is when you don't have the words, how can you communicate uh, uh, otherwise? And when your kids don't have the words, how can you listen in other ways than your ear to see what they're really trying to tell you?
Mm,
People are speaking in lots of different ways, but are we noticing?
that is interesting. And how do you go about that? Wait, let's go again to your daughters in particular
Mhm.
because they're right there at their ages of the middle school. So how do you go about that? What are some of the things that you picked up?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, my wife has just been so amazing at this, just being so gentle in encouraging them to find other ways to communicate. If I could euphemize, because sometimes it's just come out in these very strong emotional bursts that can influence a whole room. It takes one person driving poorly on the highway to ruin it for everyone. In a household dynamic, that can happen too. And my wife's way of gently encouraging, like, how can we find another way to say that without invalidating their original expression and their original intent. That part has
Interesting.
just been eye opening for me because we bring our own familial dynamic to our new relationships, our marriages, and our children. And we sort of without thinking, there's so much default that we do in our lives without thinking, like, that's what we bring into our new relationships. And um me noticing her kind of validate the feelings that our daughters are having, but helping them find another way to say it that not only calms the whole room, but calms the speaker themselves, calms them down, makes them feel more confident in expressing it and less exasperated. Um, that's
Uh-huh.
been a really neat thing to observe and really emulate and copy. I see that be successful, and I'm like, oh, I'll try that next time as well, instead of that impulse of, I'm the grown up, what I say goes, and I'm just going to double down in my, repeating the harsh thing I
Yeah.
said, the mandate or the urgency to whatever, getting ready for school or whatever it may be.
Does that have any impact on how you have communicated then outside of the home? How you work in society?
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think I'm definitely more thoughtful about the how, the how in communication than the content itself. So, um, because I know that has just as much, if not more, impact on a situation going well or going poorly.
Uh-huh.
Anything like from running errands, if you have to ask a question in a store, how you approach them to um, whatever it may be, whatever situation, even if you don't know exactly what you want to say or have the perfect words, your tone, your body language, your distancing, all those factors can make something go well, even if you can't find the right thing to say.
Hi, Nora Jones here. Please connect up with me on my website, fluency.consulting, to learn more about my guests, subscribe to know when podcasts, videos, and blogs are released, to let me know if you'd like to be a guest, to get Team Humanity gifts for yourself and others, and, if you can, to support my work with a donation. That's fluency.consulting.
You
I
think that
deeply
I
appreciate your
have to do this.
listening
You know my
and
style
sharing.
here. I have to ask you, can you extrapolate that into the bigger society? Do you think
Mm,
that there's something that about that we can help each other in a state, community, state, national, even international way? The
yeah.
insights you just provided.
Well, I know this has been a big theme in your podcasts and your conversations is are 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 we as individuals, as people, as groups, do we feel like we're being heard by the people that need to
Mm.
hear us? And if we aren't heard with our voices, are there other things that destructive or productive that we are inclined to do as a result of not being heard with our voices, or the language that we're speaking? Is our language not forceful enough, persuasive enough? Does action need to take place? And I think that's when everyone has that moment of, um, you know, what did what am I going to bring to this situation that's going to affect the outcome? And I think that's where a lot of us hit, loggerheads, or differences, because we will disagree on, we used to disagree on just how to get to the same place. Now we disagree on the place we want to go. And I I I understand the instinct to, people, those graduation speeches that are like, "Go out and change the world." That never struck me, because I always thought it really starts in my own little corner of the world. Let me get that right, and then start looking further out. Um, Maybe it's, I don't know why that is, but that was always seemed to be more important to me than, um, trying to think that I had to fix the world's problems, by being, uh, acting in some other way. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's certainly something that's on my mind in this day and age, and, where people feel like they, uh, that those sad moments where you hear that people aren't communicating anymore with
Yeah.
people they had previously communicated with, not because of we get busy, which is a total excuse. If you want to get together with someone and be intentional about it, you should do that. You should
Mm.
pick up the phone and, shoot that note, send that email. But really, I think I lost my thing there. But, really, it's about, like, if you want to communicate and you feel like you're at an impasse with someone, really examine yourself first. Start. There's a line in, I heard this in management training. It was great. It's like, when you think there's a problem going on, start to examine the source, or like start to examine, like, the location of the source of the problem with your desk first, and work in concentric circles out. And it's true. It's like
Yeah.
I'm starting with the man in the mirror, and when you go from that perspective, that small to large, when seeking to make sense of the world's problems, uh, I, for me anyway, that's been my approach. And now, if it's a generational thing or personality wise, I mean, I can be as extrovert as the next person and as introvert as the next. I'm very grateful for learning that Daniel Pink term, ambivert. Someone who can be both, who can get their energy from people and also from solitude.
When you that's I love
There's a lot
the
there.
thoroughness with which you address that particular aspect. And here comes the question about, as especially you look inside and you think about what it is that you've just expressed about learning, about starting with ourselves, with reflecting, with the idea of language, but also the tonalities, and I mean kind of emotional tonalities as well, inside
Mm,
as well as expressed. How does how does this apply to what you are working with now? How does what you know about language work with where you are now? You can share what it is that you are specifically responsible for, and how some of the things we've talked about, the way language works and the communication connections work, how that affects how you do what you do, how you work with the people you work with, how you help them, however you want direction you want to take that. How
yeah,
is this all folding into where you are right now and what you are doing?
yeah. Um, It's a great question. It's been on my mind, my heart, a lot lately, because, and I was talking with a colleague about this recently. There's a lot expected, in positions of leadership, and I've risen to a position of leadership, leading teams, or, leading people who are leading teams, and then, of course, being a father, but also being a coach, and and a mentor in other ways, being an uncle, and there's all these different roles that of importance. Knowing my experience as a young person, knowing how important my role models were for me, my coaches, my teachers, my bosses, even when I was, before college. So it's like, whoa, you have all these hats you have to wear, and they're like the most important hats ever in people's lives.
Mhm.
Like, how do you do that? And you really have to find ways of communicating and ways of listening, ways of approaching these relationships that can be kind of universally applied, that can be scaled, if I'm going to use a business term. How to scale your relationships, but it is because like where do you exert your energy, your time and energy, and sometimes um, paying attention to our bodies as we get older, we really have to listen to them and realize like what is sapping our strength, what is
Mhm.
getting us animated and excited, and in those roles as a leader, luckily there are a lot of things that you can apply across the board. There's these just universal approaches to how you handle your relationships. Um, One of the things that I think about all the time when I'm speaking with someone is I know there's something I can learn from them.
Mm.
Uh, I don't even if it's what not to do, you know? But I know that mostly I know that they have something really important to offer, and I'm gonna find out what that is. And it
Mhm.
helps your if you weren't curious before, it starts to help your curiosity. One of the things I love about and I've done, Gallup work, and I have so many questions about it. I think about, also, Jungian personality, communication styles, those types of things. I always like to geek out on that stuff, Myers Briggs, Enneagram. And what I find is that uh, one thing that I've learned is in all those roles that I have to play, um, people they all have a unique approach they bring that is actually refreshing if you're interested in finding that out. And so things that could be, I don't know, uh, annoyances or bugs become curiosities. Like, oh, why are they the way they are? I bet I have a instinct about why that is, why they are the way they are. Let me learn more about them and see if that's the case. So I think applying that, like you've always got to learn something to learn from someone, and uh, uh, that's really helped me apply some like active listening skills, and learning and like actually practicing and using, particularly with my kids, like them as that daily practice to, kind of try out some approaches on
Yeah.
to kind of learn how to better communicate. But it's a lot. I just going back
Yeah.
to that conversation I was having with my colleague, and there's there's just a lot of pressure and a lot of noise and a lot of voices, in that if you don't have good boundaries set up, if there's a reason why practicing mindfulness is so important, because we can drive ourselves nuts with, the monkey mind, or just constant
Mhm.
input, and oh, now I'm going to go apply this, and this leadership trend or this communication trend, and most of the stuff that survives is the stuff that's universal and applied. And I like to spend
Yeah.
time with that, with those basic principles around communication, so that I can apply them to all aspects of my, all those different roles I have.
That's really great. And, I've it's one of the things that you mentioned again was the Gallup, which we
Mhm.
actually worked together with there, some years ago. And I'm still fascinated by the fact that there's words that have specific meanings, but the implications of those words. What are your top 5 Gallup
Oh my gosh.
strengths?
So this is funny you asked that, because I took it again. So the first time I took it was 2018, and then the
Mhm.
next time I took it was like 2025. And I remember my 2018 ones because I made an acronym out of it. And the acronym or the anagram, whatever it is I ache. So
Oh,
IACHE. And it's not in that order, but they are the top five. It's input, adaptability, empathy, harmony, and context. So it
oh,
was a lot of like, it's funny because like my wife and I were both on our yearbook staff when we were in like middle school and high school. Both my
oh,
daughters
golly.
like it. So we love to remember. I have pictures from all sorts of, walks of life in the past. And I love a deep dive, and nostalgia is really big nowadays. And so I'm on board with that. And so those were my 5 and 18. When I did and those are, analytical relationship building, really, and like harmony. I was like, that makes sense. I'm kind of conflict averse because, again, growing up in a big family, like you kind of don't want the spotlight on you in certain ways. And then when I did it again, it was like ideation, like empathy stayed in the top 6 or 7. Ideation came in there. In the top 5, adaptability and context
Oh,
stayed. Intellection came in, and then harmony stayed. So, just a little more introverted, I think, a little more like analytical and thoughtful as I'm getting older, and less around influencing, or I think my woo dropped, win others over a little bit. And maybe that's that idea that the older you get, maybe the less you care about what others think, so to speak. I think it's important to think about what those real people in your day-to-day life, those meaningful relationships, absolutely you should care what they think of you. But maybe in the broader scale, it's letting some of that stuff slide a little bit more. So that's what I've gotten a little bit more introverted, I think, since my last Gallup test. So what do you think about that? It's funny that I always go to my bottom 5 and I'm like, what am I terrible at? Or and I
oh
that
no,
approach is
don't
wrong.
do
I
that,
know
Charlie.
exactly that approach is wrong, and I like we need to clear it up. And I think some people are reticent to even give those tests their due because they're afraid of what they'll find out. And
Mm,
and I haven't really nailed this down, but like, what is that way of looking at how we solve problems or how we approach things in life? I just look at it through those top 5 lenses first, right? Like, is there a
yeah.
better way to explain how we approach, the bottom part of those 34 research based skills?
You're asking a real question here, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because we don't worry about trying to access it through those pathways
Mhm,
because we don't naturally walk along them fluidly. We can admire them, but we don't apply them almost seamlessly, invisibly,
mhm,
automatically. It's just not the skill set that was provided to us at the particular in our life, and we're designed to be able to achieve our purpose by working with that which comes beautifully to us that we don't even notice our gifts because they're so easily accessed and so easily used. I think you may
right.
remember that I was astonished, mortified, I would say, when I found out that communication was my next to the last.
Oh,
And
no.
here I
You're like,
am talking about communication, but when I read more about it, when I understood more
Mm,
about it, I recognized that the you and I have talked about this. We have this connection. We want people to be heard. We
mm,
want them to feel seen and to be included and to have the biggest of opportunities. And communication, as it's in this case a Gallup definition, is one that's more like storytelling. I'm not going to be in a pub
mm,
standing up and telling stories you know, while holding the 3rd pint. I'm
right.
just that's not how I work with communication, but I still accomplish the goals of having people understand things because of the way I approach them using my naturally fluent skill sets. Did
Right.
that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, no, that does it. it makes a lot of sense, and the whole idea behind it is to like, hey, look at what you already have, and unfortunately, like going back to our default settings that we have, we've been designed to find negative things much more quickly and harp on
Mhm.
them than the positive things, and so in that spirit of self-awareness, noticing and having that making the choice in the moment to not revert to our default way of thinking, which can often be negative,
Yeah.
to say, "Let me just bathe in these strengths and lean on them in the way that I was wired or in the way that I was nurtured, so that I can I can really lead with them and plan for all the places where I'll need support or coaching or direction, that we all need and ought to
Yeah.
ask more for rather than pretending like we know anything or we don't have a bottom 10 or whatever it is. It's just, that kind of theater of life is grating on me, and it's like, let's just be honest, like, where are we at with this particular problem or approach or relationship? Like, let's be honest about it.
Well, and think about good athletes are the ones that have coaches. Professional players are the ones where the whole team command demands excellent coaching,
Mhm. Yeah,
right?
and
I
it's
don't
I come from a long line of well, maybe not a long line, but a lot of my contemporaries, I played Division 3 sports, and a lot of my colleagues went into or classmates went into coaching, and the amount of attention they pay to technique. I think that there's something to be said for the going back to like tone. I think there are a lot of coaches, especially male coaches, but it could be universal that really just think like the harder they are, like the more like their players hear it, and I it's not really borne out that way. I think for every, Bobby Knight who's been successful, there's, um, insert John Wooden, John Wooden, somebody who's
Mhm.
been was incredible, like never used profanity, never raised his voice, and it showed an incredibly respectful tone that also not only probably made fine gentlemen as they grew up, but also like won games, like made an impact, was effective. I find that when it comes to coaching, like that that approach and all aspects of our life is much more important than any sort of like when you're dealing with like technique or a problem, like here's what you did wrong kind of thing,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
people's defenses all of a sudden come up and, well, I was thinking this and I want, that default ego mode, like my ego's under threat. How you give feedback is just so important because it can shut the person down or it can get them to be like,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay, maybe I'll try that next time." Uh, it's everything. The approach on how you give feedback is everything, and coaching and, mentoring and stuff.
It's interesting that I've not had a discussion with anybody, outside of this one here with you about the idea of that coaching is really a microcosm of both the linguistic part, right? And
Mhm.
also those things that you brought up, the meta-linguistic parts, the the body language, the tone, it's a combination of that, and it is related specifically to the communication with an individual who needs specific information as well as encouragement. That's a very interesting
Oh,
insight
yeah. I
there.
mean, I remember giving feedback to I coached an 8th grade boys basketball team a few years ago, and I was we were in the middle of the game in a timeout, and I'm looking at him, and this kid's mind was elsewhere. Like there were so many things going on. First of all, let alone the fact that he's 14 years old, and basketball is so intimate. The parents are right there on the sideline, and I'm sitting here
Yeah.
telling him to do something different next time with urgency and flailing, and you can only imagine, like, is this really going to getting through to him? Oh, he's kinda nodding, and part of me was, like, in reflecting on that, I was like, "Maybe I should just get him to, like, speak it back to me." Like, "Alright, so say it back to
Uh-huh.
me like what I'm expecting of you." I think that would help a lot more because a lot of times in sports, you're just like, "Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh," anything to, like, get the heat off of you, to do that, but, I think with sports is there is there's so much we can learn from it that is being played out right now outside of the, hysteria or the fandom, like that religious element I'm not crazy about in American life, but the element of coaching, of, practicing, of, practicing with people or practicing alone, all those little disciplines, I think we can
Mhm.
apply to so many other aspects of our life.
No question, no question. Well, when you think about where you are right now in life and work, family, however you wanna take it or all of it,
Mm,
where are you headed? What
yeah.
what is it that's happening? What's important to you right now where you're like, this is what I have got to be able to do and say. This is
Mhm.
where my message lies.
Yeah, um, I think regarding where my message lies, it's really actually narrowing down that message and that focus, and, um, as someone in a generation that has had I don't know that we've had some prominent leaders, in Gen X, but realizing that we do have to start finding our voice as, people that grew up in that maybe wallflower kind of "I'm gonna bail on the situation" type
Mm,
generation, w we have to start speaking up, but also we have to be reminded that our actions, it's that idea of preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. So whatever your gospel is, live it out for sure. But while you're doing that, finding the words and finding the best way to communicate that is really important. But I mean, you got to focus on the message first and understand like what are my values, like where are they and how do I need to communicate them out to the people in my life that that need to hear them the most. So it's I think with all the competing ideas and voices right now, like focus and like concentration for someone like me who's like always excited to open up a bunch of different tabs and learn about this and try that is really, like, narrowing down, like, "Okay, Charlie, like, for the next week, like, what is that thing I can really focus on where I can make the learning last or solidify it so I can bring that to whatever I wanna do in um, the next stage of my life?" And I am starting to think about those chapters, and I appreciate the question because it's an important prompt you don't get enough sometimes in your
right.
life that yeah, what's next for you? Well, picking up the kids at 3. No, it's like, that's your daily life. Let's zoom out, Charlie. Like, those are the
Yeah.
trees. Let's think about the forest and what can you, kind of connect with and secure as an area of focus for the next time. So, really, my focus is finding that focus. If that if that's an answer.
Yes, it is an answer. It is an answer indeed. What do you hope for your
Mm.
family, for your community, for this country, for the world? What is your biggest hope?
Um, Continue talking. Uh, Continued open lines of communication because when that stops, other things go in its place that are much less productive and much more destructive and divisive. So even if you aren't getting to the heart of a matter with an opponent, so to speak, keeping lines of communication and keeping um, building building on experiences, those moments to get more aligned will hiccup up out of those continued exchanges together. But if you
Mm,
never have those exchanges, you're never going to have an opportunity to get anywhere closer from your division than you are. So it's just about staying in communication. That's so important in our families and in our in our town, state, county, all those things up. Um, once communication stops in whatever capacity, particularly with words and exchanges and just spending time together. Um, it's a real challenge for what comes after that. So that would be my hope, is staying in touch.
It's a wonderful hope, Charlie. Is there any question that I failed to ask you today that you would be like, oh, and I would have loved to have talked about that. I really would love to share that, but we didn't get to it.
It's so funny you asked that because I recently started asking that in interviews, and just to see if there was something. When and a lot of folks will say, no, you know. But the idea is that you want to give time to think about that, and um, I think I actually love that we did talk about sports a little bit because when it one of the things that I've really enjoyed about my life is being able to have parents um, who love books, were English teachers, right, and love literature and loved watching football. I mean, love basketball and sports and athletics, and it's really so important to have that full experience, mind, body, soul, and um,
Mm.
it's I find that we can categorize and compartmentalize our lives too quickly. So I don't know that I wished you'd asked me about it, but maybe I inserted it anyway because it's a big part of my life. And obviously, we're here on the eve of a Super Bowl in 2026 with the Patriots playing the Seahawks. So it's certainly been on my mind living here in Massachusetts and going back to that religious approach to sports. It's certainly apparent here in this part of the country.
That's for sure. That's for sure. There's a lot of prayers being lifted up
Oh, yeah, the
currently in
vestments, the
Massachusetts.
chants, the incense, the libations, all those things, yeah.
Yeah, libations in particular, I'm assuming, are being poured out all over the place in Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see come Monday,
That's
someday.
great. That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Thank you for listening to this episode with my guest, Charlie Henship. And I hope that while you were listening to Charlie, you were picking up where you are motivated by, connected by, and empowered by language and languages in your life. Please go to my website, fluency.consulting, to see more about this episode and my previous episodes, to check out the 15-minute language stories, and to check out my line of merchandise, Team Humanity. I look forward to welcoming you again to a new conversation, and until then, enjoy language. Go deep.